Welcome everyone to the November 5th, 2024 SIG Node meeting. We currently have one topic. Dan and Surya, would you like to present? I can give one of you.
Yeah, I can share my screen if you can give me the access.
Okay, let me just make you co-host real quick.
Thank you.
All right, you should be able to.
Okay, I'm gonna try. Okay, I think everybody should be able to see my screen.
Yeah.
Perfect, I can get started. This is my first time in SIG Node, so if I say or do anything that is not supposed to be done, just correct me or stop me. I'm from SIG Network. I'm here with Dan, and we're here to talk about one of the KEPs that we have. And like I said, I'm not a SIG Node expert at all, which is why I would love ideas and help from this community. So there's a link to the enhancement, which has way more details than what I'm about to present here. So I'll try to keep the presentation short on why we're here with the whole redesigning kubelet probes. First off, let's just look at the high-level problem that we're trying to tackle from SIG network perspective. So usually with the network policy feature, when we create a network policy in a namespace, default deny gets applied to all pods in that namespace, right? And then you do this explicit allow rules on top for allowing traffic. But when we do the default deny, we deny everything when we create the network policy, including the kubelet probes, which are required for the health checks, right? But then in this case, for the network policy, we had to open a hole to make sure that the connection from the host to, that is the same node to the pod, works for the health checks to work properly. But again, this is a bit icky. We documented it. And so this is really up to the CNI implementations to open that hole, which probably was not intentional, but this is the workaround we have in place to make both these features, the probes and policies, work together. So that's one of the main premise here, and sort of the crux here on, can we maybe redesign the probes to not go over the pod network, which is where the policies and the communication and everything is happening? Is there an alternative that we could do to avoid this problem and make it nicer? Right, and this is one of the many problems that are outlined in the KEP, but this is the top one that we're after here. There's also a second problem here with security issues on the host field, specifically in the probe. So this can be set to any, and this is in the TCP or the HTTP type probe. You can set it to any external entity or local host, pretty much anything. And then you're basically forcing kubelet to go and probe that entity. This can open up to a lot of server-side request forgery attacks where kubelet is blinded here, right? And there is no verification of any sort. So this host field is a bit tricky. And the initial use case to have the host field was to be able to do probes towards the load balancer IP or the service IPs, which is a valid use case, but they can probably do the same using exec probes anyways. There is an issue that I've linked here, which has been a really long-standing issue, and I think maybe Tim and a few of you already know about it. I'm just trying to come in and learn and help here. So this is one of the other side problems we had with the KEP, but in order to solve this, we have a short-term solution. The long-term solution, obviously, is to try to deprecate the existing host field and maybe have an alternative or maybe not have an alternative. It's up to the KEP will try to decide what we move towards. But in the short term, we have a smaller KEP with the SIG auth community to add a pod security admission baseline rule that can at least help the admins block users from setting the host field. But these are the top two reasons. There's several others on the KEP, which I don't want to go into the details here in the meeting. So feel free to read the KEP. And Dan and I are here basically with a bunch of ideas, mostly Dan here should take the credit for this. We're here with some ideas. These are not really solutions. They are somewhat thrown in the air, right? And we would love to hear from SIG Node what everybody thinks and how things should work out eventually. So instead of doing the probe, which is going from the underlay to the overlay of some sorts, if we want to put it that way, is there a way we could just make probes also part of the pod network? So have a probing pod, and then we have a feature called admin network policy, which is an out-of-tree API, which builds on top of network policy, but for admins. And using that, we can actually have a strong allow rule that sets that is default set somehow, which allows all the probing pods to talk to all pods in your cluster for the probing, right? But point being here that one of the ideas that we're trying to do here is like, what instead of making the probe go from your underlay network to your overlay network, why not just make it all on the overlay to simplify things? That's one idea we threw. And then maybe the second idea we had is to use containers, ephemeral containers in the pods, which act, come up for probing and go away of sorts, right? So again, a big idea we have, not saying that we should do any of these, just throwing out some ideas here. Another thing we did have was why not just use exec probes and get rid of all the network probes. But to do sometimes express things like curl or nets or other commands to do the probe itself, you might need the binary, which is probably not installed on the workload pod. So maybe exec probes don't work for all use cases that the network probes support today. And there were also some concerns around performance, which we haven't really verified, but there was this blog post which we did find, and it's also outlined in the GEP. Another idea we had was around the NS enter, just do an NS enter or something like, and try to do the exec probe directly, like using a cry method. But then what happens to Windows containers where this is not supported? Or just do what I said above, but using CRI and, just offload it to CRI instead of Kubelet doing it. That's, yeah. So basically that's a bunch of ideas. Maybe I threw them all randomly at the same time. But what Dan and I are here for exactly is to just, ask SIG Node what you guys think about this, and to get some reviews on our GEP, especially on the solutions part. And maybe you guys have new ideas that might help us. And yeah, I'll stop here and take questions.
I think once in the past, I think Antonio also opened an issue around it. The idea was that we delegate it to the runtime, and then on the runtime side, we have a persistent container monitoring process both on the cryo and containerd side. That process could potentially be part of the network namespace of the pod, and then it can directly launch these probes. But I'm not sure how it maps to the Windows side.
So, and Antonio did file an issue about this a long time ago, but there was never any discussion of exactly how this would work. So yeah, that's kind of what we're trying to figure out, what makes sense in terms of Kubelet and CRI. So you're saying there's the existing monitoring process that's already part of.
No, it is not. And Peter, you can chime in and correct me, but it wouldn't be very hard for it to join the network namespace of the pod and stay there. So then when the kubelet requests the runtime to launch a probe, the monitoring process can launch it. It's already in the network namespace. That way we can avoid launching more processes. So any solution like exec probes or starting containers or starting new pods will be very heavy, because even today the exec probes are very, very heavy.
Right.
So we want to avoid new processes launched along the way.
The new containers and stuff in the pods ideas were all that there would be like a new persistent like sidecar container or something like that, not a per probe. Yeah.
Okay. So I think the persistent aspect makes sense, but what I'm thinking is maybe what if we just reuse the container monitor process that we have instead of adding another pod or container.
So one issue with that is that currently we have 3 different kinds of probes. There's random TCP connection, HTTP with various things, and then now gRPC based probes. So would Containerd and Cryo have to learn how to do each of those probes? Would Kubelet be able to pass that through somehow, or?
Yeah, I think Containerd or Cryo will have to be able to do those probes and figure out how the responsibility is split between the main daemon and the monitors. Done.
Actually, I think I agree with you, the Manu. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I agree with you. The execute the probe actually is heavy, and also it's difficult today. Actually, it's caused a lot of problem for our production, right? So, but I do think about the proper pod actually better than what we have today. And because it is will be synchronized, all those kind of things can do more logical and also can manage. It's manageable. Today, execute probe actually is, to me, a little bit unmanageable. And the problem it is goes to the namespace. That's also to the user. The problem is the complexity to the user because we have to charge those resources. Depending on how expensive, how costly it is, then we are going to charge it to the user. So end up, it is also cost like the user, the application level of the resource usage actually is unpredictable. It's more complicated for them. So that's kind of things. So that's why I feel like a pod actually okay, and other proposals, CRI, all those kind of things, at least not worse than what we have today. I just want to comment.
So are you talking about having a separate probing pod for each pod that has probes?
Have the separate pod for the node. I'm not saying for the. My understanding, you didn't propose for the separate pod for everybody, right? For every pod require of the probe.
The idea that we had was that there would just be one probing pod.
Yes.
Per node.
Yes, that's my understanding. So that's why I think about this is better than what we have today.
I just thought you were talking about like accounting to individual users, right? And in this case, the probing pod would still be part of kubelet essentially, right?
It's part of the system overhead. Yes, that's what I understanding. I think this is the better than what we have today. But then for the other idea you propose list here actually could be charged to the per pod, which it is not worse than what we have today. But I do see there's complexity for user. I hope I make that clear because there's a several proposal, right? List of things and my concern. I like this proper pod, and we take over as the per node overhead, just like what we have today. The reason it is from the user perspective, I feel like today, there it is the complexity we give to the user if it's charged to the per pod or per container.
One good thing before I yield to Sergey. So I think, Don, if we have a per node probing pod, that will still have the issues that the first issue they raised, because it will need to be able to join all the network namespaces of the pods, right? But if we have a pod,
Yes.
an additional container within each pod, which acts as the overhead for the probes, then it gets charged correctly to the pod, and it's also part of the network namespace of the pod.
So the Surya skimmed over this in the presentation, but in the KEP we talked about one of the problems with having kubelet do it is that kubelet has the nodes IP. If we have a separate pod, that would have a pod IP on the pod network, and then we can create an admin network policy saying this pod is allowed to talk to everybody.
Okay.
Which and then it only applies to that one probing pod IP, so it doesn't have the side effect of allowing other traffic that we didn't want to allow, like we have now when we allow the node IP to connect.
Okay. All right. So I guess I'm seeing like a table here, 3 options, and then we debate the pros and cons.
Yeah, there are these options, and there's more detail on all of them, and then there are some other ideas as well in the KEP. So I guess people who have opinions on this should go and read the KEP and see and help us out. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to think of whether this will be a replacement or a new type of probing, because current probes from node network already have some properties, like, for instance, it ensures that port is open. And like port has this port opened, and like people declaring the probes can be sure that it happened. Like we have like other types of probing, like if you have load balancer and load balancer goes to pod, it also ensures some other properties of pod. So what if we move to network, like pod network, then we losing this part of a validation, like that port is open. So maybe we will need to have this as a new type of probe rather than as a replacement of existing probes. And people who are more secure, more want faster probes from a node network, they can keep using what they have, and people who want better security, they can move to different feature. That might be one option. And in general, like deprecation and removal of features at old is scary for me.
So I think this is listed as an unresolved issue in the KEP, but it's leaning towards we would deprecate the existing probes and replace them with very similarly named but different semantics probes. There are issues with what you were saying before with the existing probes, though. Like you talk about using, the load balancer, knowing that when the probe succeeds, it will be able to connect to the pod. But the problem is that since the network policy implementation has to have a special rule saying kubelet is always allowed to do health checks, then that means that you don't actually know that the pod network is properly configured to allow anybody other than kubelet to talk to the pod. So you kind of need the what is it, the pod readiness probes or something if you want to be sure anyway. Pod readiness, what conditions, status, I forget what it's called.
Yeah, this is fair. My point is that it has some properties that are different from properties of new solution, and we need to make sure that we are not losing properties, or maybe we have like those as alternative. And if performance will be different, we also need to consider, is it worse performance ever had?
Yeah, hopefully performance is not going to be worse. That would be bad.
Yeah, we also at some point discussed whether we want to have file-based probe, like CRI, instead of checking for different protocols and such, it just looks for file on the file system. It kind of more straightforward, and then we can let customers implement whatever they want as a probe, and then we can just check the file system for a file. That may be another performant alternative for that.
Problem with that is the process, something failed to clean up the file if the process crashed. Anyways, that's a tangent.
I'm catching up on the chat, noticing Tim had suggested if the CRI method acted like a TCP proxy, isn't there already a CRI method for that? Like, isn't that how the kubectl proxy or there's some sort of like streaming to a pod thing, isn't there?
Yeah, that's kind of how exec and attach works now. Is it like there's a bunch of layers of proxy between API and then kubelet and then CRI, and the CRI translates, like exposes a URL that the client connects to, basically.
So it may not be usable directly, but the architecture is already there within CRI to give us a proxy to connect to something in the pod.
Yes. Also, port forwarding works this way now as well.
Right. So maybe the action Dan and Surya is to update the KEP with any feedback from here, and then the action on the SIG Node side is like we review it for the next 133 cycle. Yes.
That would be awesome. Yeah. Thank you, Manu.
Okay. Tim, did you have something to add?
I just wanted to ask about, so one of the motivations you gave was for the blind SSRF attacks, which are around the use of the host field. And I'm wondering if that's a use case that we still need to support in the redesigned probes, or can we just get rid of that field or heavily constrain what's allowed to be placed in there?
So I think basically there's no easy way to have that feature and make it be safe to use. So yeah, we were just going to kill it and say, if you need to do something strange with connecting to, some weird IP, you can do that with an exec probe.
Sounds good.
All right. I guess we can move on to the next topic. I think, Tim, it's you or what resize stuff.
Yeah, I just wanted to share a quick status update on in-place pod resize, kind of as an FYI. So with code freeze coming up in 2 days, there's a lot that still needs to merge for us to hit beta. That dashboard link that I shared in the agenda has a list of issues that I am considering beta blocking. Almost every single one of those has a PR open. So we're mostly reviewer bandwidth constrained right now. The one caveat is there's a couple large PRs that are in flight. One is adding the new resize sub-resource. I'm hoping that these will both merge today, hopefully relatively soon. And then that will unblock a lot of follow-up PRs, which will need to be rebased on top of the changes that are there. So yeah, really coming down to the wire. I don't know if we're going to hit it, but I think either way, it's worth continuing to push to get as much in as possible. Then that way, even if we don't hit the beta, we can still have more time to test all of the changes that went in over the 132 release cycle. If we do manage to get everything merged, my plan is to do the beta bump, graduate the feature to beta, and then use the stabilization period to really hammer away on all of the changes that went in. And then if we find anything that is concerning, we'll just roll that back to alpha and then target beta in 133. The one other thing to mention is on that dashboard, I've added a priority column. The P0s, I think, are top priority to merge in 132, kind of for the reasons I mentioned earlier, just to get some extra monitoring signals and extra kind of soak time and test time to validate those changes. The P1s are things that will block the beta, but are less critical to merge in 132. And then there's a few nice to haves on there as well. So yeah, just wanted to share that status update. Any questions on in-place pod resize in general? All right.
Thanks for the update, Tim. I think that's the end of the agenda, right?
Yes, it looks like nothing else has been added. So maybe we can adjourn early this week unless anyone has any last minute things pre-code freeze. Great. All right. Thanks, everyone. Happy code freeze, and we'll see you next week. Oh, at KubeCon if you're going. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.